In less than a decade, two words transformed from an academic hypothesis into a binding commitment that would reshape the global economy: net zero. Governments worldwide pledged to eliminate their carbon emissions by mid-century, a promise that would require reimagining virtually every aspect of modern life. But how did we get here so fast? How did we go from a theory from a handful of climate scientists into a restructuring of entire economies, affecting billions of lives, without the kind of rigorous debate that we'd expect for decisions of this magnitude? This is the story of net zero, how it emerged, how it spread, and how Canada committed itself to one of the biggest economic transformations we have ever seen. This is Net Zero, a race to the bottom. Well, it all began with an academic paper from Oxford University published by Miles Allen and some other researchers in the Nature journal. The paper proposed a direct relationship between cumulative CO2 emissions and global temperature rise. The conclusion? To stop warming, we must reach net zero emissions. It was an elegant theory, perhaps too elegant. Climate science relies on thousands of computer models, simulations of an impossibly complex system with countless variables. But within just 4 years, this relatively new framework was adopted by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC's 2013 report incorporated the carbon budget concept, lending institutional weight to what remained a contested scientific approach at the time. Critics would later ask, how much scrutiny did this theory actually receive? The answer may have less to do with scientific certainty and more to do with politics. Fast forward to December 2015. World leaders gathered in Paris for what was framed as civilization's last chance to save the planet.
There are political gatherings, and then there is this. Never before have nearly 150 heads of state and government filled one room. So many foes today united under the banner of climate change. But an agreement in Paris is still a long way off, and the woman charged with securing a deal missed no opportunity to capture the political momentum.
Dear friends, never before has a responsibility so great been in the hands of so few.
The result was the infamous Paris Climate Agreement, signed by nearly every nation on Earth. Buried in Article 4.1 of the agreement was a commitment that would have staggered previous generations: reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the second half of the century. It meant phasing out fossil fuels that had powered human prosperity for over a century. It was going to restructure agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, and energy systems all at the same time. The economic implications, staggering. The technological requirements, unclear. But what was clear was that the political momentum around net zero was simply unstoppable. Fast forward to 2018. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, organized by the United Nations, released a special report that moved the goalposts dramatically. Now, net zero wasn't needed by the end of the century. It was actually needed by 2050, cutting the timeline in half. What started out as an academic theory in 2009, by 2018 became an immediate crisis, requiring immediate and drastic transformations of economies. And this is where governments began declaring climate emergencies. Now, dissenters of net zero were increasingly portrayed not just as skeptics engaging in legitimate scientific debate, but as deniers, climate change deniers, standing in the way of human survival itself. When Canada signed the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, there was little public scrutiny, if at all. This was when Justin Trudeau declared to the world that Canada is back.
Canada is back, my good friends. We're here to help, to build an agreement that will do our children and our grandchildren proud.
Canada is back? Well, for a nation whose success and prosperity was built on natural resources, on gas, mining, and oil extraction, this presented an existential question for the country. Nonetheless, the commitment was made and Canada was on the path to net zero, or so it seemed. By 2050, Canada would achieve net zero emissions. How all of this would be achieved remained vague. What it would cost us was uncertain. And Canada didn't have the technology to achieve this goal. Nonetheless, the promise was made and the debate was seemingly settled. What followed was a rush to implement policies, carbon taxes, emission caps, regulatory changes, all in service of a target set in Paris. Communities built around traditional energy faced uncertain futures. Workers in resource industries had to worry about whether or not their jobs would exist in just a few years' time. Canadians watched as gas became unaffordable, while politicians promised it was all necessary to save the planet. Fast forward again. We're now in June of 2021 and Canada makes its biggest leap towards net zero. The Canadian government passed the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. Net zero wasn't just an abstract idea. It was now enshrined into law in Canada that we must reach net zero by 2050.
Making Canada net zero by 2050 an ambitious goal, now legally binding, at least on paper.
Bill C-12 lays out a framework of accountability and transparency that will ensure we reach this goal in a way that gives Canadians confidence.
But it didn't even stop there. The government then made an even more ambitious target: reduce CO2 emissions to 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. Not 2050, that's less than 5 years away. Canada had pledged to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, a target that officials say has, quote, guided Canadian climate policy. To meet that goal, rapid and dramatic action was required. That forms the background of where we are today, without even touching on the specific pieces of legislation, including an EV mandate requiring 100% of vehicles sold in Canada by 2035 to be electric vehicles. The cars that Canadians have driven for over a century would be phased out by government decree. But now we're going to get to the reality of the situation. Not everyone, of course, was convinced about net zero. While government officials spoke with certainty about Canada's net zero targets, this idea that we could actually achieve this, researchers began to start asking uncomfortable questions. The Fraser Institute, a Canadian public policy think tank, published studies examining Canada's emissions reduction plan. Their findings were stark. Canada's current approach would fail to achieve net zero by 2050. The targets were, in their assessment, not achievable with available technology and current policy tools. Now, to fully understand the economic case against net zero, we need to hear from someone who has studied climate science for decades, someone who has testified before Parliament, who has examined the models and the projections, and has come to a controversial conclusion. I spoke with Professor Ross McKittrick of the University of Guelph about his findings published in the Fraser Institute about Canada's net zero targets. What did your economic modeling show you about Canada's plan for net zero?
A few top-line takeaway messages. The first, not surprisingly, we don't actually get to net zero. And the constraint there is just to do that, we effectively have to eliminate fossil fuel use. And you don't need an economic model to tell you that that's just way too costly, way too devastating for our standard of living. We don't have any reasonable way of getting there. The second issue was that the policies that get implemented, well, they cost a lot, but they don't all cost the same. Some of them are much more costly than others. If we think of it in terms of the cost per ton of emission reduction, the carbon tax actually turns out to be the cheapest. And then all the others go up from there. Things like the EV mandate, the clean fuels regulation, the restrictions on the oil and gas sector. A very expensive one, actually, is the building energy efficiency codes. I don't think people have really talked about that very much, but the plan proposes a massive increase in the required energy efficiency of new construction, and that adds considerably to the cost of building. So that's another takeaway, that it's an inefficient mix of policies. And then as far as the top line cost number goes, I would say the number comes out at, as of 2030, you're taking away about $6,000, $6,500 in real income per worker in the country. And then if you keep tightening along the schedule that they've proposed, by 2035, that's gone up even higher. By 2050, it's up over $8,000 per worker. And so again, you can run models like that, but what that tells me is that's way too costly. People aren't going to put up with it, and the government isn't going to stick with it.
So it's going to cost that much money per worker. But what about in jobs? Because the argument from the government, they say that we can transition workers into the clean energy economy. But I think from what you've found, that this is going to have a major negative impact on jobs across the country by 2050.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate when governments make promises like that. The net zero plan will not be a net job creation mechanism. It will create some jobs in a few sectors that are subject to mandates and heavy subsidies, like EV manufacturing or solar panels or things like that. But they're completely dependent on the government policy. But they're more than offset by the job losses in other sectors where the costs go up so much, the market shrinks, we become less competitive. Back during the debates in Ontario over the Green Energy Act, I don't know if some of your viewers might remember, then Premier Dalton McGuinty said by mandating windmills and solar panels, they will create 50,000 jobs in Ontario. And it wasn't true. It never happened. We lost jobs because electricity prices doubled. So yes, there were temporary jobs installing solar panels and building wind turbines, and then those jobs ended. And altogether, our estimate at the time was we lost close to 100,000 manufacturing jobs because of the increase in electricity costs. So this promise of job creation and new industries, I think in the end, that does a real disservice to the politicians who want the public to get behind these policies, because they're not being honest about the costs. If you were honest with people about the costs, you might get their consent in the end, and it would be informed consent, and they'd stick with it even when the costs become apparent. But when you promise people it will be cost-free and there'll be more jobs and higher incomes, then as soon as it becomes apparent that that's not the case, then whatever consent you thought you had evaporates.
Now, what would be the result, rather, for global emissions if Canada were to completely erase our carbon emissions and our carbon footprint, as they say?
Well, we are about 1.6% of global CO2 emissions. So if you shut down the entire country's CO2 emissions, it's a rounding error in the global total. At this point, the US, China, and India are so dominant on the CO2 emissions front. Europe is large as well. Countries like Canada, like I say, if we shut everything down, you would hardly notice the change in global CO2 emissions. And then if you look at, well, what if we achieved something like the Paris target and cut emissions by, 10%? Well, that's 1/10 of what's already a number that's too small to see. So what Canada is talking about doing, whatever the rationale for it, here again, politicians need to be clear with people. There's nothing that we can do that's going to materially alter the course of climate change over the next 100 years. We can do something because we want to participate with other countries. We can do something because we want to, take on our share of a burden. But let's not tell people that we're stopping climate change or or somehow going to change the course of the climate over the next 100 years. And the further element to that is, if we adopt policies that reduce our emissions by making it so expensive to do business here that all those industries just move to China or India, the net effect is likely to be an increase in emissions, because our electricity grid is very clean. Like in Ontario, we have some natural gas plants, but otherwise it's nuclear and hydro, so there's no emissions. So you shut down some kind of heavy manufacturing facility in Ontario, reopen it in China, where most of the electricity is made with coal. Now you've got higher emissions than you started with. So we bore a cost, we lost those jobs, we lost the investment, and global emissions went up. I would say that we still haven't really come to the point of realization yet. I think there's still a lot of people, certainly in the green movement, but also connected to the current government, that still think this is a viable path, that still think we just need to find the regulatory toolkit. We just need to impose a little bit more cost. We're still a ways away from the full realization that this isn't the right target, and these aren't the right tools to try to reach it. And this is there have been big disappointments in the past for the climate movement, when they thought we really won the policy debate. We've got the policies we want in place. And then a few years later, those same policies are being dismantled, not necessarily by the opposite end of the political spectrum, sometimes by your own people. And the next big disappointment for the climate movement is going to be the formal abandonment of net zero. And I think when that happens, that's going to be just a much bigger trauma for the green movement, because they put so much of their hopes, and they seem to have so much of the political class on board with net zero, but they are just up against impossible technological and economic constraints.
Now, I wanted to see what real emissions reduction innovation looked like, so I had the opportunity to travel to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and tour the Weyburn Carbon Sequestration Facility, majority owned by Whitecap Resources. This facility receives captured carbon, uses pipelines to then take that carbon dioxide and sequester it into the ground and extract oil. This is not just a way to improve efficiency in the oil extraction process, but it actually reduces emissions. This is real. This is not pie in the sky. This is not an academic theory. This is what is actually happening on the ground in Canada to reduce emissions in the oil industry. What you are looking at is one of several injection satellites at the Weyburn Mid-Ale facility. This is what CO2 injection looks like. There is a metering system here, which allows operators to control how much CO2 each oil well will receive. This is a receiving area for the CO2, which Whitecap receives from a carbon capture facility in North Dakota. This site here in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, receives captured CO2, repressurizes it, and injects it deep underground to enhance oil recovery. It's important to stress that the Weyburn Mid-Ale facility is not a typical carbon capture facility, but more accurately would be described as a carbon sequestration facility. And this is one of several injection wells at the Weyburn oil field. Right here is where CO2 and water are injected into an oil well deep underground. On the left side is the CO2, and on the right side is the water. Every aspect of the Weyburn facility is operated through technology at a command center on site that allows safety monitoring and control. It might look like a bunch of pipes in a giant field built around some structures, but make no mistake about it, this is a very complex and efficient operation. Behind me is a paradox that epitomizes Canada's net zero agenda, punishing the industry that is creating the technology for these emissions reduction solutions? Did the politicians and bureaucrats who imposed net zero by 2050 on the Canadian people back in 2021 actually believe that it was possible to begin with? Or did they know that net zero by 2050 was impossible, making this potentially one of Canada's greatest political deceptions? The government said that the country would be able to reduce their emissions by 40% of 2005 levels by 2030. But the cracks are already beginning to show. Mark Carney has refused to commit to reaching Canada's 2030 goals. And perhaps the most important discussion of all when it comes to net zero is this. At a time when Canada is racing ahead of our geopolitical enemies to net zero, what will they do for the environment? What will China and India and Russia do for the environment, who, by the way, have not committed to net zero by 2050? Canada committed to reducing emissions 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. The deadline is now less than 5 years away. Current emissions, however, for Canada, 8.5% below 2005 levels. To meet that target, Canada would need to cut 40 million tons per year, every year, starting now. Recent reports confirm what many suspect. The 2030 target is out of reach. Canada isn't on track. We never were going to be on track. But perhaps what's happening in the rest of the world matters more, far more. China's CO2 emissions in 2023 up 4.7% to 12.6 gigatons. Coal demand in 2024 up 1% to a record 4.9 billion tons. Record coal demand in China. India's coal demand projected to grow over 5% to 1.3 billion tons. Total emissions in 2024 up 4.6%. Together, China and India account for 87% of new coal power capacity added in the first half of 2025. Global coal use in 2024 hit a new record, up 1% over 2023. Canada contributes roughly 1.5% of global emissions. Even if Canada were to eliminate every emission tomorrow, global emissions would continue rising. The math is simply unavoidable. Canada is imposing economic costs to meet targets it won't achieve, while the world's largest emitters build coal plants at a record pace. We've returned to where we started. This is where Canadian ingenuity has created world-leading carbon capture solutions. This facility currently sequesters 2 million tons of CO2 per year. Throughout this documentary, we have traced the origins of the net zero movement in this country. We've examined the crushing economic costs associated with reaching net zero, and I've also highlighted the hypocrisy of the government targeting the very industry that is creating these technological innovations. We've heard from Professor Ross McKittrick, highlighting the mathematical impossibility of Canada reaching our 2050 net zero target. Since 2005, despite spending billions of taxpayer dollars on reducing Canada's carbon emissions, so far, our country has only reduced 7%. But perhaps the most damning evidence is this. While Canada puts emissions reduction targets on our industry and oil and gas production caps, China, our supposed geopolitical enemy, continues to open up coal-fired power plants. And they are doing so, by the way, at an unprecedented rate. And now, we are facing an economic reality in this country. While Mark Carney and the Canadian government begin to back away from these net zero targets, starting first with the backing away of the EV mandate and Carney's refusal to commit to Canada's 2030 targets, it's becoming clear that net zero in Canada is impossible. Many people know that it's impossible, but yet we continue to put policies in place with the intent and the belief that we're somehow going to get there. So we must ask ourselves this. Is Canada's net zero agenda about saving the planet, or is it about something else? When politicians passed the Net Zero Accountability Act back in 2021, did they really think that Canada was going to be able to achieve net zero? Or did they know that the physics, economics, and mathematics were simply not on their side? The evidence suggests, quite frankly, that they did know. They knew that Canada's allies and our enemies were never going to commit to net zero the way we were. They knew that the technology required to achieve net zero wasn't scalable in the time frame that was put into law. They knew the economic costs would be staggering, yet they passed the law anyway. The Weyburn facility behind me represents what's actually possible, what's real. Incremental technological improvement from an industry committed to improvement. What this doesn't represent, however, is that net zero is achievable. No matter how many politicians use facilities like this as a political backdrop. Perhaps it's time that Canadians demand honesty about what is achievable, rather than continuing to pay the price for what is politically convenient. Net zero might be convenient for some, but it is certainly not possible. Thank you all for watching this documentary. If you like this content and you want to see more reporting on Canada's natural resources and energy industry, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, like this video, and share it with your networks. Thank you all for watching.